fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we'll do a really quick introduction. I know we are running late, so just your name and where you work, and then we can start. Maybe we start from there?
Everyone, I'm Laura Allen.
And then you can just...
Okay, hello everyone, I'm Laura Allen, I work for Google.
Hi folks, I'm Jessica Rafuse from Microsoft.
And Christopher Patno from Google.
Ofenza Madisha, Uber.
Brianna Gilmore, also Uber.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Yachi, working for UNICEF Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office.
Good afternoon. Ruben Gisore, Technical Director, African Organization for Standardization.
Good afternoon. My name is Derek Simiyu. I'm from Communications Authority of Kenya.
Odhiambo Oko, Safaricom PLC.
My name is Shuaib Choklan. I'm from the African Disability Forum.
Hi everyone, I'm Steve Njenga, part of the Enable team.
Hi everyone, Nabisubi Renita from MasterCard Foundation.
Hi all, Kevin White from the W3C.
Hi, Linda Okolo, Kenya Airways.
Hello, Abdurrashid Abdullahi from Digital Partners, Digital Identity.
Hello everyone, my name is Balkis from Djibouti, National Agency for Disability Person in Djibouti.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you so much. Now we have an idea of who's in the room. When it comes to standardization, I've always had Lucorito right next to me because he's very technical and the expert. But I guess today I'm going to do my best to run the show. So we are going to start off. The conversation we want to have today is about developing Africa's digital accessibility standard. We still have to think about policy, we have to think about legislation, we have to think about enforcement, but we do have a plan in place. We've actually been working for the last 3 to 4 months together with ARSO and Kenya Bureau of Standards and ADF. Together we've been working on a proposal for developing Africa's digital accessibility standard. So at least we know that process is ongoing and our partner is willing to fund the project, but we need to make sure we have a continuous conversation so that we also make sure we have the right stakeholders as we develop the standard. I know sometimes standards are developed by standard bodies and then you're given here, go run with the standard, but I think the conversation we had the last time is we have to make sure the right people are in the room. We have to have users, people with disabilities. Users are also private sector companies that have to implement these standards when they're developing their digital products and services. But even just educational communities, but most importantly governments, because when it comes to legislation and policies, government plays a big role. So I think I will hand over to my dear friend and he can start us off maybe by just first explaining what's the process of us developing Africa's standard, and then we will continue with the discussion.
Thank you very much, Irene. And I'll stand for a while, but maybe as we continue, I will sit down, because that is how we work in the traditional setup in Africa. You don't talk a lot when you are standing. The process of standardization is very simple, in the sense that if you are inside that environment, it is quite simple and straightforward. So the African Organization for Standardization is an intergovernmental body established in 1977 to harmonize standards for the continent. And also, not just to harmonize, but also to carry out educational activities related to those standards, as well as conformity assessment. So in that respect, it is a body that governments are represented by the national standards bodies. So Kenya Bureau of Standards is one of the members. Rwanda is one of them. And when we mention it, we say it is the countries that are represented. Why they are represented is the fact that the Bureau is a gateway that allows all the stakeholders in the country to be members. You can participate as private people, as organizations, or as government, or research institutions. So meaning that Kenya Bureau of Standards acts as an agency that puts together the stakeholders in the country to participate in the also processes, in what we do at the continental level. Because you cannot take all the 50 million Kenyans to participate in the work. So you have to have a representation through a recognized body. So currently, the membership is 43 countries. That takes more than 90%. Actually, the bigger countries that are not members are Mozambique and Angola, which means even the population that is not part of ours is very small, less than 50 million people in Africa. Doesn't mean that they are less. We value them and we are working together to ensure that they join. So how does the process start? The process is initiated when there is a need that has been expressed. And from our end, as an organization, we know that Africa has an inclusivity agenda. Agenda 2063 talks about a continent that is inclusive. And we do have quite a number of protocols that talk about the inclusivity of everybody in the development of the continent. So then what do we do? As we were thinking about what we need to do, we actually encountered Enable and Kenya Bureau of Standards telling us we have this product that we'd like the rest of the continent to benefit from. Do you have a platform that we can utilize? We told them, yeah, we have been thinking about it, but we haven't actually established a committee to look at it. So then we started the process. We requested Kenya Bureau of Standards, as is usual, that they can write to us what we call the preliminary work item or a proposal for harmonization of standards. And they did that. And since we didn't have a committee, we started the process of establishing a committee to deal with this process. So that committee will be approved this week. By Thursday, it should be in place. So we have been working, actually, that's why we didn't appear here very much. So we have been working to ensure that it is justified and legally established within our framework in ARSO. Once it is established, we make a call to the member states to ask them to nominate people who have an interest and ability to contribute towards harmonizing these standards. So those who have the ability may not be in the national standards body, but the national standards body has to go out of its way and get the people to participate in the work. So there's no excuse that a country can say we don't have experts. There is no country in Africa that you can go to and find that they don't have an expert in certain areas. There are very few. But sometimes because we don't know them, we think that we don't have them. In certain circumstances, they can even get a consultant or somebody from another country to actually represent them. That happens a lot. So meaning that we are extending the invitation to all the countries in the continent to participate in the work. When they do that, the first meetings, of course, we have to choose who is going to be the person leading the work. In terms of, when you have many people, there has to be somebody who is like the chairperson, someone who is the secretary, someone who is a lead expert in this area, and all these people can contribute. One thing that we don't do these days, we don't develop standards or harmonize standards and hand them over to people. We have to include those who are going to use these standards. How are they represented? You'll find that in Kenya there's the associations and the organizations established by government. These are the people who may know what exactly do the people that we represent need. so that you can tell us whatever you are proposing is not what we need, it is this other thing we need. And this is how we want you to reflect it in the standards that you're doing. Because the standards are not done for us. As people who are in ARSO, as people who are in government, they are done for those who need them. And to that extent, that's how sometimes even the laws are supposed to be done. They are done so that those who are in the sector who need the laws can benefit from those laws or even standards. That is how we do it. It is the voice of those who need the standards that we need. And I'm emphasizing on that because we know we have experts who understand what is required. I don't want to go and have people in a committee who are pretending that they know what some other people need. So I will request Enable to make sure that we do have the right experts coming from whichever country, whether it is Mauritius, whether it is DRC, it's Rwanda, Kenya, Egypt, or whichever. We need the right people. And how do we do it? Sometimes we have to be very specific. We are not the bosses of the countries. We are a secretariat that they established. But we sometimes have the right to guide them, to tell them that we would like you to give us a person with the following kind of characteristics or qualifications so that we can have the right people. I don't do the standards myself. I act as a director to just guide you that these are the procedures. And the procedures are like this. The proposal has been made by Kenya. We have taken upon ourselves the idea that we need to establish a committee. We have asked the countries, do you think this is a committee that we need? They have said yes. Now we get it established. We now need to get the experts to do the work. Now when the experts meet, they will look at the text, the various texts that exist. We are lucky that Kenya already has the text. But when you are harmonizing, there are other people might come up with other ideas. They might be good ideas that we may need to include, or they might be proposals that after explanations you find that they are not good, so you don't adopt them. If they are good ideas and they are not in the current standards, then we include them. If the standards that we have, they are already too, and they find that they need more, then they give proposals that we can do more. That's how we go about it. Now, once we have agreed that we need this and the text is available, then the committees started discussing. Do they establish working groups to focus on specific aspects, or they want to talk, be in one sitting room? If they want working groups, they can establish them. Working groups are small, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 people who can meet very informally. They don't have to be very official. They are experts. They can meet very informally, but tackle the subject as experts. In the working group, you'll have a convener. And a convener is supposed to be a good expert in that subject area. And so we will need a lot of expertise to really focus our ideas to getting the right standards. I'm not saying the standards we have are not right, but we want to make sure that at the end of the day, that process is very credible. So once that is done, then we take the standards out to the committee looks at it, sends to national stakeholders, because at the national level you have many more people. So Kenya will receive the document, expose it to the national stakeholders, ask for comments. And then those comments are submitted back to the committee that is run by ARSO. Then we shall look at what kind of comments have come in. Sometimes the comments are like, this is nice. Please go ahead and give us the standard. And they can make sure, sometimes they can make it possible that they don't want a very long time. They want this standard immediately. There are mechanisms to handle that. Now, if there are many more comments, we will now again put together the document and send out for what we call public review or public inquiry or inquiry. It depends on whether it is the English, British, or the whatever, but it is the same. To avoid that, we say public inquiry or public review. Public review means everybody has an opportunity to contribute. Those involved, whether they are users, those involved, whether they are regulators, those involved, because at the end of the day, these are standards that will affect trade in certain goods and services. So you notify the WTO that we are doing this kind of work. And if there is a person from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Iceland, or whoever, who thinks this standard might affect me, they would point out, this standard will affect me in this manner, and I would like you to change it this way. So everybody gets an opportunity during that time to give us more inputs. We engage with them. And when we do that, we also inform the WTO, this is what we've done, so that we don't want to go directly to Iceland or New Zealand or Australia. We just circulate back to the WTO Secretariat so that they can respond. They can tell those who have given us comments that this is the resolution of your comments. After that, we expect that we have resolved the public review comments. Then now, the standard comes back for approval at what we call the Standards Management Committee at ISO. Then from there, it goes to the council. Now, the whole process can take a very short time, as less as 1 year, or it can take 2 years. But we believe these are good standards. They cannot take 2 years. They should take a shorter time. It becomes difficult when you are doing research to create the standard from zero. When you already have one, it is easier. Now, when I mentioned that, there's something that you will need to take note of. Yes, we have digital platforms that we can use to make people meet. You understand the process is that we have called for experts. These experts need to meet. They can meet virtually. And when they meet virtually, it can take a very long time to get the standards done. Because they will meet for 3 hours. We don't go beyond 3 hours. And discuss one paragraph. Then they meet another month, because they don't meet every day. So the provision that we have that delivers the standards faster is when you have fiscal meetings. And when you say fiscal meetings, it means that you have to get people to travel and meet in a room, in a place like this, in a room like this. Now, this room, you don't meet without paying for it. Those experts, they need to travel. They need their tickets. Some need visas to be paid. And when they're here, they need, sometimes as grown-ups, you may think that you provided everything. They need something else. So sometimes you need to provide some out-of-pocket provision for them to be okay. So that's the those are the types of resources that go into making standards. It's an expensive process. And that's why sometimes we have to really go out of our way to mobilize resources from partners. Now, the work of standardization, whether you are in Europe or you are wherever, is supported by a lot of people. Some who volunteer to support out of their own, do we say goodness? Some who volunteer to support because they know how that benefits the society or the industry or the sector that they are in. They know that these standards can assist in ensuring that the legislation gets addressed. Because the legislation comes in, it says the building must be accessible to people with disabilities, all types. When that legislation says so, It doesn't provide the money for the building owner to do exactly that. It doesn't even tell the building owner what kind of materials or goods that should I buy that can make the work do it. So the standards will guide you as to what kind of materials you need, what kind of designs do you need that can allow for that law to be achieved. A good example is in Europe, where they give you directives. And for you in the industry, or for you doing anything in Europe, that directive, if it affects you, is for you to prove that you have met it. Now, they realized that it is very easy to meet these directives, or the requirements of those directives, by using standards. And that's why you'll find that industries contribute to the development of European standards, because those standards then assist the industries to meet the requirements of those directives or regulations. So in Kenya, we have the regulation, we have the law. It tells us a lot of what we need to do, isn't it? Does it give you the money to do it? It doesn't. So we have to mobilize resources to meet that kind of requirement. And that's why we always have to look for partners to assist in ensuring that we can get the standards. But when you get the standards, is that the end of the story? It is not. You need now to reach out, even to the same government, to tell them that if you use these standards, they can assist you to get that law to be implemented. If you use these standards, you can assist the people that you have in mind to get the kind of services or access that they need. And once they realize that they can do that, then they adopt those standards into the legal system by giving, in Kenya they use the legal notice that buildings shall comply with the following standards. So normally the laws, if it's a law, a legislation, does not give you parameters. The standards will give you the parameters that you need. It will tell you the kind of measurements that you need. The standards will give you the measurements, but the law does not give you the measurements. And that's why the standards then assist in implementing the laws very effectively. And that's the direction we want to take. I would like to pause at this point so that we can have any inputs. Maybe because Lukorito is online, he can also contribute in that direction. I've not finished. It's a long, talking about standards can take a very long time. But it's better that I stop here and we can have questions, and then I can see from what angle can I contribute in the discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe before Lukorito jumps in, let me give Shoaib too.
Sorry, Christopher, before you. No, I was so fascinated by this discussion that because I've had a similar experience where we worked on a universal design accessibility standard in Dubai, and I was a consultant for Boston Consulting Group. And well, I wasn't employed by Boston Consulting, but I was like consulting for them on this particular accessibility universal design standard. And we used the international standard organizations. So I wanted to ask you, what's the relationship between ISO and the ISO, the International Standard Organization? Because you often find that in standards that they have already formed, they are very quick to form a working group, as you mentioned, 7 or 10 subject specialists that come together and then work on something. And even on the Universal Design Standard, they review it constantly, and then they reach out to people, because now they will have a review on digital accessibility. So then they would design a new standard, and they will work possibly with the European Union standards bodies. So I wanted to know what's the relationship between ASO and those structures.
Thank you very much. And you're right. We participated in ISO, and we've seen the kind of expertise that is usually put at play. Very good expertise. And sometimes people actually volunteer to do the work. They are not even consultants. Yes, ISO is our partner. We have a very good MOU. We access all their standards as also on behalf of our members. So we even at the moment we are trying to identify in which committees can we do standards jointly, the same way they do with the European Union, the European Committee for Standardization, CEN. So that is the relationship we have. If there is anything out there in ISO that would be good for Africa, they are our partners. So you can be assured about that.
You want to go and then? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Kevin White, W3C. I'm kind of curious because what you're describing potentially leads to quite a lot of disharmony in the global standards space if you are if what I'm hearing is what you're suggesting. So you take the standard that you've got, develop it further, change it, open it to public comment, ratify it in a different way. That potentially creates something that's different from the existing original standard. And that might be not aligned with EN 301-549 or that root standard, or even below that, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which makes it, is that not going to make it harder to play in the international space? I'm missing something.
So I would comment, but I differ because we've gone through the process before. Lucarito, can you hear? He wanted to say something. He's moved again.
Actually, one of the best things about standardization is that if you have an international standard, for example, ISO, or there's a standard from the European Union, or a standard from STM, yeah, in the US, we would, as much as possible, try not to deviate from that, because that would make us not be in, we want to be in a bigger field, not in a smaller field. And that's why we have to send it. If we have made any changes that might disadvantage us, that's why we are sending it out to the WTO, which is global. Then other people will look at it and say, why did you even bother to do this? Yeah, we don't want to be asked that kind of a question. If there is something that would make us play globally, that's what we go for. Yeah, so there is no deviation.
Yeah, let me give Lucarito and then Ima a chance to speak. Lucarito, maybe you can also touch on the work we did with the Kenya standard, because it's the same one as the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. I just start off from where Ruben has left on ISO and how we cooperate with the ISO in developing international standards. We are members of ISO as KEBS, and we also participate actively at that level in developing international standards. We participate in quite a number of technical committees, including some that touch directly on accessibility. Having mentioned that, I'm also privileged to be a technical or management board member at ISO. Therefore, we also oversee some of this work that come to us for approval at that international level. Therefore, I sit on that particular board, ISO Technical Management Board, and specifically looking at what are the specific interests that could affect even developing countries that should be brought on the table at ISO for discussion and approval as new work items. I think we are very supportive at that level, and I will be looking forward to getting some of the work that is being done on the African continent being upscaled to the international level at ISO. And as a board member of ISO Technical Management Board, I'd be glad to support such work and also rally behind my colleagues on that board to approve such work items to progress at international level. Having mentioned that, I'll go back to what Irene has mentioned about our involvement in the development of ICT accessibility standards. Actually, we are the first country in Africa to develop such standards. Therefore, as Ruben was mentioning, sometimes there's no need to reinvent the wheel if there's already some work that has been done. Therefore, we based on quite a number of other standards, international standards in Europe. Those formed the basis for us to look at what can go into a standard for ICT accessibility. Therefore, the first standard was, of course, on requirements. Then the second one was on how to measure that actually what you have specified as requirements conform to those requirements. Therefore, the second part of that standard was conformance. Therefore, there are those two parts. Part one talking about requirements for ICT accessibility, and when you are talking about requirements, you've captured quite a number of items. Those with visual impairment, physical impairment, quite across the field of ICT accessibility. So that's something that we considered, and in doing so, as Ruben was mentioning, we did involve quite a number of stakeholders and those real users, those who are affected by the standards themselves, including manufacturers as well. But most importantly was to bring on board the people with disability themselves so that they can bring their experience in the documents so that we do not sit somewhere as the national standards board and then develop some requirements that are not in touch with what the people with disability need for those ICT equipments, even including software, to be accessible to them. So that's something was that that we did really consider in the development of those initial standards, and that we are thinking of upscaling them to the international, to the ARSO level. But most importantly, as I was mentioning, I think involvement of stakeholders is very important. And we have quite a number of categories of the stakeholders that were involved. I've mentioned about the people who will be affected by those standards directly. Then we also have the regulators. I'm glad I can see my colleague from CA Communication Authority in the room, Derek. He was part of that team that was working on those standards. We also had the regulators like ICTA who are working on those standards to control those items on ICT equipment. Then we also had those who are interested in manufacturing the same equipment. That's it cuts across. And really the last point that was mentioned, I think research and development is also very important. Then we had to bring on board academia and researchers also to look at the requirements that go into this particular standard. Therefore, cutting across, we had quite a huge representative of stakeholders working on this standard. And one thing I would like to mention, I think standards development is a very expensive venture also. Therefore, we had to organize quite a number of workshops which involved a huge amount of money to be spent in organizing those workshops and bringing the people to the table to discuss documents. And most importantly, again, we realized that those people with disability require special support for them to participate in these activities. Some of them will need guides to help them come on the table for them to get the input into the standard. I think all that involves some quite huge amount of cost that we need to consider even as we think of upscaling these standards to also level that there is a cost that we need to be aware of and alive to it, that it will involve huge amount of money, and also ensuring that those people who are affected actually participate. They need the support. If I'm not disabled, for example, I will just come along in the meeting, then I participate actively. If I have a hearing impairment, perhaps if I come to that meeting, then I will need a sign interpreter to accompany me specifically to help me also understand or pass over the messages that I need to pass. If I'm visually impaired, perhaps there's also another requirement that I will need a guide to also even help me move around the rooms and all that. But Therefore, there's a huge cost. Instead of just supporting again one person, perhaps if I have a disability in one way or another, then I need another person to help me also participate actively. I think looking at those all factors, financial contribution is also important for us to consider, and also technical expertise. If you do not have specific experts on the data, again, then we shall need to perhaps look at how do we bring on board people with specific skills that are required, or even the technical expertise that will go into the requirements of this standard. Yes, we've developed the standards. These are national standards. But as we move them to the African standards, then some of the requirements will be required to be modified, others will be required to be changed, and perhaps there are other areas that we didn't look at it as a national body that will require inclusion in the development of those particular standards. Therefore, what we are providing as a national standards board, and we've already provided the proposal to ARTHO, is a preliminary draft, I would say. At our level, it's a national standard. But as we move into the continental level, then it becomes basically a preliminary draft that require a lot of adaptation, a lot of research again to be incorporated in the requirements that will go into that process. But just to sum up, we've taken the initial steps because we realize the importance of upscaling these standards into continental standards rather than remaining the national standard. And I'm glad quite a number of other national standards bodies have tuned into this conversation, so that when we pick the process up, then we shall have that critical mass that require us to develop an African standard that encompasses all the requirements across the continent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucorito. And I want to make sure, Kevin, we answer one question. So the document will not look very different. It's really the same. And I'm saying this from the experience with the Kenya standard. If you look at the Kenya standard and the EN, it's one thing. So it's the same thing that's going to happen, but the process is very critical because the users, these are Africans, these are people with disabilities, these are civil society groups, these are private sector companies, have to be involved through the entire process. And something interesting that we experienced the last time, you could literally spend half a page, debating about half a page for the last like 2-3 hours. Why? Because you have to listen to the stakeholders, and their feedback is very, very critical. And we went through various, and Derek, you guys were there, we went through various sessions of really going through the entire document. The beauty of it is when you're done, the people who are involved totally understand the document in and out, because you want buy-in from the beginning. So involving people, getting them to debate. I can tell you we spent so much time debating about the word may and shall. Oh my God, yes. Exactly, because certain words in Europe, if you say may, in Africa, nobody will do anything. Okay, so you have to, if you have to even use must or something. So anyway, that was a very great learning experience for all of us, because yes, those are some of the changes that you might see on the document, but it's not gonna be anything technical that totally changes how a requirement is done. I hope that's helpful. Okay.
So is that enforcement language as opposed to technical language is a way of thinking about it?
Exactly. And it's really making sure that you customize the standard to the local culture. Because simple English words mean totally something different to another environment, yes.
So on the question of enforcement, I'm just curious, is there thought about how this will be enforced, as well as how it will be reported by businesses and companies? Is there thought about the process for that yet?
You've gone like 50 years ahead of us. So we've thought about it, but we've not completely developed the plan. We are still in the process. And because we understand there has to be a process in place for implementation and enforcement. So whichever way it is, we are yet to completely decide. So we're still in the early stages of how do we develop this standard. And remember, we have 43 African countries that are going to participate. And I think the minimum number is 6. Yeah, as long as 6 countries participate, we're good. But maximum will be 43 African countries. So it is a complex process because of the number of countries involved, but they have the process in place. Kenya Bureau of Standards submitted the proposal, so it will definitely get done. But yes, please.
Just a question on the relationship between the standard setting process and where we are with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because I think there's a bit of a path there, especially with the digital protocol, to really weave in the right language. I think the digital protocol is open. There's a few annexures that are open for comment as of last week that could potentially need us to weave in the right language. So maybe there's an opportunity there. So I just want to know where we are on that front and if we're thinking about it in that format. Thank you. No, I think I was to comment on the earlier one about conformance and requirements.
Yeah, okay, on issues to do with the FCFTA, if you look at Annex 6 of the agreement, you can already see that when it comes to matters of standards, it's ARSO that is mentioned there, as well as our sister organization called AFSEC, the African Electrotechnical Standards Commission. So we work together in that. So as soon as a requirement comes out, particularly from that kind of agreement, then for us it is to interpret what does it mean in terms of provision of standards and conformity assessment or conformance. So that's what we do. Then we provide the necessary standards to meet that kind of requirement. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Derek. On the part of the free trade agreements and discussions, I will not perhaps be an expert to give input, but I would like to just point out the experience on the earlier standard that was done. The separation of the parts has really sorted out most of our challenges. And part one that deals with the requirements is front-facing, and that's what manufacturers really work with. Countries and all the decision makers, they dwell more on the requirements, because once you meet that, then the conformance bit will just come in to check whether you've done what the requirements is. So the language in the conformance testing is the one that is now customized to ensure that each administration is able to implement that standard. And that's where, for us in Nairobi, we picked on some specific words that will help our industry understand the need to implement the requirements. So this standard is very adaptable, and it provides room for global experience and for global usability first in the requirements. Then at the point of conformance, you now are able to do as much as your capacity is. There are some things even in the conformance that require a lab testing. So if you are not on the lab testing, you will want to ensure that somebody who did the requirements has made the requirements, then you assume that that standard is fitting for you. But if you go ahead and do some local testing or enforcement of the same in terms of helping you implement, then you will have the guidance of the conformance part 2, which will lead us. But universally, once we acquire the requirements, we are good to go. Thank you.
Perhaps I can mention something on what Erica has said, Eric. I think Erica has put it very clearly that those are two parts. There's the first part on requirements, then there's the second part on conformance. Perhaps when it comes to conformance, we upgrade this document to a continental standard, then the other requirements. And I'm very glad that we are developing even mutual recognition agreements across the continent. So that if a product is certified in the ECOWAS region, for example, let me say in Ghana, if it's certified, then we recognize that certification as being equivalent to what we certify in this other part of the country, like Kenya. Therefore, again, with those certifications and mutual recognition agreements, then we can have free flow of these items if we have the standard in place. Therefore, the most important part will be for us to put in place the standard. Then when it comes to conformance, despite the different countries having different requirements and regulators in place, then we shall recognize the mutual recognition agreement as part of what will facilitate the AFCFTA, as has been mentioned in the room. I think there's a huge market in the African continent for these ICT accessibility equipments and softwares. Therefore, it will be important for us to look at how can we actualize the mutual recognition agreements across different countries in Africa as we facilitate the full implementation of AFCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucorito. Anyone who has a question, comment about the process? Go ahead.
My question to the leader from ARSO. You mentioned that the standard can take a period of 1 year or 2 years and such a period. What really informs this entire season, considering in your submission you mentioned stakeholder consultation? I was thinking that perhaps whenever you are not beginning from ground zero, the period can be variable but shorter. But is it maybe a standard, or is it locked in some process that it must run for a minimum of 12 months for it to turn around? I know a year is still very short, but why is it cast on that stone?
Okay. The most important thing is that stakeholders must be given enough space to participate, to comment, and to get satisfied that it is addressing their needs. So that's why it takes long. If it wasn't, then we would have taken it and said, or we can even take the standard and give translators, and then we tell everybody, if you are speaking Portuguese, here is the standard. Now, they will not accept it. Standards must be owned by those who need to use them. And that's why it has to take that long. So that's how it is. It's like a locked system, as you said. Yeah. If you go shorter than that, people will not accept it. They didn't participate. Yeah. That's how it is.
So I actually...
Just an additional point on that, on the time frames. Again, I think in Africa, if we compare the duration that we've harmonized quite a number of standards, it's relatively shorter compared to the global practice. At ISO, for example, if I may just give an example, as a technical management board at ISO, the fast track process takes 18 months. That's fast track. That means you move very fast within the process of 18 months. And then the normal period for developing a standard is usually 36 months, not 3 years. Therefore, looking at that duration, and then we've done relatively well if we can be able to develop a standard under 18 months. That's pretty well compared to the global practice. In ISO, extended period goes up to 48 months. That's 4 years until for one standard to be developed. I think we are doing well, but again, it depends on building consensus within the different stakeholders and different countries. Looking at an African standard, for example, how shall be building consensus among countries beyond the stakeholders. Perhaps the only stage they discussed that Ruben needs to mention, should have mentioned, is the WTO requirement for public inquiry. That's public review period. That is a fixed period. It's a requirement in WTO that the document has to be circulated for 60 days. Otherwise, the other stages are within the control of the stakeholder. How fast they move, how fast they build consensus will determine the period it will take for the standard to be developed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucorito. I was just commenting and saying that I do agree with you, because I think from the last experience we had, it took maybe 12 months, Derek? Maybe 12 months for the Kenya standard. And it was a very busy time. It was very, very busy. And it was important to make sure those who are participating are having a chance to review the document and give their own feedback. And they debate and debate until tomorrow. So I think 12 months is reasonable. I don't know about 24 months or 48 months, but yeah, but I think that's where we are. So maybe we should jump into maybe a conversation about how does this affect the users, especially private sector companies. I can see Safaricom here. What do you do when the standard is ready. Actually, the Kenya standard is ready. Maybe you can tell us if you've even had a chance to look at it or implement it. But I think it would be great to hear how the standards affect the private sector companies. Or do you want to say something?
Sure. Okay. And Chris, feel free to chime in. So within Google, we have worked for many, many years on taking external standards and figuring out, okay, what is the Google version of that? Figuring out what pieces of different versions make the most sense to be cross-platform, because we're developing across so many different platforms, across mobile, across web, apps, across hardware and TV and watches, all sorts of things. So early days, we had to sort of take what was available within WCAG and also expand it based off of what we believed was the right sort of standard for Google. So we've created our own sort of internal version, which we don't publicize, because it's Google specifically, and we've scaled it, and this is something that we've been working so hard to evangelize across the company in a very systematic way, working across all of our different product areas, because we don't all report up through the same teams. We all report, we have a centralized accessibility team, which Christopher and I are both on, but we also have many, many, many different product teams in many different corners of the company. And I think a lot of the large tech companies do operate this way, where we have different parts of the organizational structure, and how do you figure out the right ways to be internally standardizing and implementing external standards. So some companies may be creating sort of their own flavors, but leveraging external standards, which is what we have done. And now as more standards are getting released, and as the EAA is coming, and EN 301549, and other sort of variations, we're working on how do we implement those aspects that differ. What is the delta between WCAG 2.1, 2.2, et cetera, and EN 301549 and others. And that's where it gets complicated, where we are dedicating so many resources internally to this, to try to understand and demystify where do the deltas lie, how do we do this, what are the different ways that we have to report this in different countries. With the EAA, for example, are there actual per country, we know there are, but per country specifications that are different that we have to dissect and understand and weave in, and how do we do all this? So we would strongly love to simplify. However we can simplify and make it clearer of what is that delta, that will be much, much, much appreciated. But the one other comment that I'll make before handing it over to see if you want to add anything, Christopher, is I asked about enforcement because it helps us. If there's weight behind this, if there's weight behind people enforcing the standards, the regulations, it helps us get further prioritization internally. It helps mobilize the teams to actually drive. Of course, there's so many different reasons to prioritize accessibility, and we don't ever want to use that sort of bottom bar of, okay, you have to do this, or there's a possible litigation if you don't do this. But at the end of the day, it helps us. So I will say, we urge you to try to push for this and push across. Otherwise, it might not actually scale and take flight across Africa. So I'm glad to hear that you're thinking about it, but it's good to think about it early, even though it's not yet time to really be thinking about enforcement.
And the one thing, this is Christopher from Google, the one thing I do want to add is that we also try to partner with organizations and legislators to understand how what we are thinking of impacts, share the information, so there's a dialogue. So if our interpretation isn't theirs, we have that opportunity to talk about it, because we don't want to wait, do what we think is right without having all of the information necessary, and then find out you're not doing it right. So having that conversation, so we have our internal work, we have our external work, and together we try to put together something that is comprehensive and as meaningful as as many people as possible. Do you want to share some?
Hi, this is Jessica from Microsoft. Very similar processes, this won't surprise you. What we're really seeking is clarity for our engineers, so simplification. We have a lot of folks that work in very different areas of the business, and so to the extent that we have clarity for them, and that really requires the harmonization that I think you all are striving for, is really important to us. And the second thing that I'll add is to make room for innovation. We don't know what the future of technology will hold, but we know that if we have conformance, then we can create more inclusive products. So please please think about how we innovate from the standards to provide a future that really creates the most accessible products we can for people with disabilities.
Sure. Brianna from Uber. I'll maybe plus one to all of this, I think, especially on in enforcement when I joined Uber a couple years ago, which is still, of course, we're a relatively young company compared to Microsoft and Google. And it wasn't until the EU enforcement of accessibility standards really motivated a conversation with our regulatory teams. Did we have any energy behind meeting WCAG compliance? So it wasn't until the regulatory enforcement. So plus one on enforcement, maybe not something that you always hear from private companies, but it absolutely, absolutely helps motivate the resources and the prioritization internally that we are always looking for. We are always trying to fight for this prioritization. I would also say in a similar way where I'm hearing the conversation on the regional kind of language specificity, I would say that it's just as necessary to think about when you're training engineers and product developers and product managers across the region in this area. I would say we work with a range of external consultants and experts in the area of implementation of a standard, and I would say it's going to be just as important in the coming years that we can look to African experts for the implementation and compliance on this standard, because we don't want to have to be looking to the EU or US experts to try to interpret an African standard that's been so meticulously and thoroughly thought out. So if there can be emphasis with regulators and educators to also be educating the next kind of class of informatic expertise and engineers, that will be very helpful as well.
Just to echo Brianna's sentiment. So in a different kind of setting, 3 weeks ago we were at the Universal Accessibility Summit in South Africa, and what came out was that the journey for participation and having the right people's voices heard is really hard. So the president has a commission, and there are 7 other organizations that believe that they should be part of that commission to make a contribution. They're even writing to the president to say, we want to be heard because we are legitimate representatives of this particular group. And what I would say is, as potentially, this is an institutional proposal recommendation, potentially we probably need to look at how even the organizations and how they're formed need to potentially be standardized. It needs to be clear in terms of how you can build appropriate representation. Because at this point, it can go as far as people saying, you know what, these are people you picked, they're your friends, and they're here to represent your interests. And therefore, it's an unclear standard, an unclear outcome. We're not going to support it. You know, so that would be like my most immediate contribution on that front.
I just wanted to pick up on the enforcement. So in many countries, like in South Africa, if a standard is developed, it is then becomes legislation. So it becomes law. So you have a universal design standard, it becomes law. Right? So South Africa, it took a different turn actually. It's a very interesting anecdote that a lawyer in a wheelchair, the South African new constitution was adopted by the parliament in 1996, and a woman in a wheelchair user had to represent the client in court, and it was on the 2nd floor of a building, and then she had to get the judge to delay the trial because she couldn't, the court wasn't accessible. And then she took the government to court, the Ministry of Justice, and she won. You know? And the court, the Constitutional Court, forced the government of South Africa to make all public buildings, government buildings, accessible. It's only then that they developed the standard. Right? They had the building code before, but not a standard. It's 2 different things. So now they have a situation where standards are developed by the South African Bureau of Standards, and then it becomes law. Right? So There's no separation between the two, basically. But if that is not the case, and this is the interesting part, I'm just not going to speak on behalf of African Disability Forum. So we are a continental lobbying and advocacy group. This is what we do. If there's a government, let's say the government of, I hate to choose governments in Africa, that I sound like I'm picking on somebody. But let's say the government of Kenya decides that, listen, this digital accessibility standard, well, we're going to delay it because we're not sure. But now they're delaying benefits to people with disabilities, to end users. And everybody's agreed now, and this is the standard that we want. And offensively, everybody's now been represented properly, you know. And we have the standard in Kenya. That's where civil society comes in. Because this is what we do, we lobby, you know, we advocate, we push, we use the media, we have endless meetings until we get to a scenario where the government says, listen, let's talk about this, and then hopefully adopt it. But that's what we want. We're very clear on what we want. And an example is the African Disability Protocol, which is a new, you know, everybody knows the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, but in Africa we now have the African Disability Protocol, which is like an addendum to the CRPD. And we've been pushing for this ratification, and it took us forever, but we have now 14 countries that ratified, and if one more country ratifies, then it enters into force at the African Union. So I think, you know, a standard is a powerful instrument. Right? It's not something that governments can easily dismiss. And that's where civil society plays a role as well. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm done.
These are very interesting and informative discussions. South Africa, of course, they have the National Regulator for Compulsory Standards. So once a standard is done by the South African Bureau of Standards, then the national regulator will pick it up and see that it becomes a compulsory standard, and then it can be enforced. It's one country where you go and find a lot of facilities. I've tried to take into account people with disabilities having access. So good examples exist that we can follow. And I do think there's a time people used to dismiss advocacy organizations, but I think it is important that you don't despair. Because when you despair, then it means nobody will speak for those who can't speak for themselves. So, and in standards, we have tried to ensure that we can have what we call champions. We use that word so that it doesn't sound like we are confronting anybody. It's actually, we are simply saying we want people who can advocate for certain things. And that is what we need, that people can take up an issue and talk about it to those in authority so that it can become a normal thing. This is one committee that we shall be dealing with, but we also even have the one on gender mainstreaming that will be approved also, so that we can start looking at those standards that impact on other communities. Now, on enforcement, this is an area that also needs advocacy. Why? When people are still okay, they don't see the need. As you said, maybe the judge didn't see the need that they will have an advocate who is using a wheelchair and therefore cannot go up. So we need that kind of advocacy to open up people's eyes. And this is something you already know, that disability comes at any time. doesn't choose. It's not like you must be born with it. It can come anytime. So even these legislators who are sometimes reluctant to put forward an idea that the executive must implement this, I need to be sensitized on that so that people can start thinking and having an inclusive view to everybody else. So these are things that we really need to do that kind of advocacy. And that's why even the standards themselves, most of the African countries, we don't have strong consumer organizations. And what consumer organizations do is advocacy. We don't have, and that's why you find a lot of fake things, harmful, substandard things going all over the place. So that level of advocacy is required in this particular area, and then we can do that issue. But more importantly, I think as we move forward with the standards, we need what we call capacity building for people to understand how to even use these standards, for people to understand why these standards need to be enforced. And the capacity building in this case, which you are looking at, is even the regulators may want to enforce them. Do they know what the standards contain? Do they know? Or can they explain to those that they are regulating what they require, they are required to do? So I think we will need to look at it, not just that we can have nice standards always. In ARSO now we say a standard is not just a nice document. It has to be something that is used for the purpose it was intended. And so if it is intended that it is supposed to be used to ensure we have accessibility, then we need to ensure that those who are involved, if it is manufacturers, software developers, whoever it is, they understand how the standard needs to be put into use. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to add something small about how the private sector is being challenged to pick up the implementation of the standard. In the case of Kenya, when the standard was prepared and launched in May 2022, the steering committee deliberately identified enforcement entities to follow up and ensure implementation of the standard. Now, 2 government organizations were identified, one to face the government direction for government institutions, and one to face the private sector. And we targeted to work with the ICT sector players, the licensed entities, the equipment providers, installers, importers, and all the vendors. Now, where I work, Communications Authority of Kenya, we are the licensing authority, and we are the one who clear operations of licenses. We monitor their compliance. So we work on that part of the private sector. There are so many investors with different levels of licenses with obligations. Our sister entity, the ICT authority, is to ensure implementation of the standard on accessibility within the government entities. And what we did is that we came up with a best practice framework where we developed a template of how you can evaluate yourself to see where you are, what you can do, and what you need support to be able to bring on board. So those 3 columns are our questioning templates. So whenever we engage with the entities, be it private sector or public entities, we tell them, can you be able to do a baseline survey on yourself? Establish where you are. This is what the standard requires. So we give them the standard. Tell them, establish your baseline. From there, tell us what you can do within your current operations. Then, what is it you need support to be able to accomplish? Because even as a regulatory entity, we find that there are some things we need to do to help the sector players, the private sector, to be able to achieve the goals of implementing the standard. But indeed, we also need to put a firm position and tell them this is an important requirement, that this percentage of the population requires access to your services. So like, for example, we've put a compliance reporting template for all licensed entities, and they report on quarterly basis. so that we are able to keep track of what they are doing. And if the resources are not aligned, then we will give them a small score so that we tell them next year when you are budgeting, please budget for ICT accessibility standards. You cannot tell us that we were not able to onboard a person with disability because we did not have budget. You can say that in year 1, but you are not allowed to say that in year 3. So that's what we have done. And in our question, we have asked the service providers in the private sector to tell us whether they are aware of the standard first of all. If you are not aware, we will give you the standard. If you are aware, we will ask you, have you complied with this standard? Or if you have complied, to which level? Then we will check the boxes as per our conformance testing. Then we will ask, can you specify the actions that your organization is taking to ensure accessibility to your services by persons with disability? What steps are you taking for your own services to be accessible? So we will then run it against hearing, visual, we will run against the physical disability, and we will look at their output, whether their web content and non-web content is accessible or not. So with that, then they are able to challenge themselves. And good enough, you know, when people know what the instructions are, as Madam said here, with an enforcement, with a requirement, most of them you find that they are able to budget and even increase usability. Then we ask, can you indicate to us the challenges or limitations that you face while serving persons with disability? Maybe they will tell us, oh, it is the built environment, it's the way the roads are constructed, it's the way electricity is served, and such a things. So then we know we need to get other partners to do their part for our licensees or ICT players to be able to fulfill their part. Then the job of the regulator and the ICT authority is to look for those other entities and ensure that they also do their part. Now, we do a number of activities. One of them is to ensure that we monitor the entry of equipment through type approval and type acceptance. So at the customs and the point of entry, we have given them the standard. We have incorporated it in our procedures so that as the products come into the country, we are checking, can this product bear some universal design? Can the person with disability have an icon where they can be able to access and activate captions, for example? So such things are now incorporated in our type approval process. Then we are doing consumer awareness and training. In our literature to ICT consumers, we are telling them you have a right to demand access. Wherever you are, you have a right to get it just like anybody else. So from that, we create a demand side for standards to be implemented. Then the other thing is that we are now doing also stakeholder mapping. We are willing to work with our licensed entities, with our private sector, to train them. Some of them call us and say, our management and our implementation teams are not agreeing, or they do not understand this. Then we organize a stakeholder forum where we sit with them and take them through the standard stage by stage. Then finally, we train ourselves internally to ensure that even people at the regulatory body are also doing what the standard requires. Maybe that could be my input for now. Thanks.
It's as if I sat beside him by design. This is my regulator at Safaricom. And we work with him very closely. So since May 2022, Safaricom has been attending these conferences. And I just looked at his mobile phone. He has all the numbers of the guys working regulatory. So he can actually tell you we have even 90% compliance with those standards. So we're in a nice place with him. So we are complying and we continue complying, but we have a lot of the engagement with the Communications Authority on these standards. Thank you.
And I just wanted to follow up on what was just said. Totally agree with everything that you just mentioned, and it's so wonderful to hear all those details that you just shared. I just wanted to sort of plus one. You were saying, you know, there's the compliance template, and that people are able to go through and sort of assess where they are. That's wonderful. The fact that you're helping with your organization to go out and do trainings and education on this, that's wonderful. I just wanted to make the broad comment of, as the standard gets more and more adopted, we're going to have to think about, like, how do you support the infrastructure to support the standard in being implemented successfully. So thinking about education, about how to do all of this, thinking about training. And one thing that we realized very early on at Google was we had a wide variety of different levels of expertise actually doing the testing. And you could get very different results on a compliance template based on who was doing the testing. Or if they had deep lived personal experience with assistive technology, it might look very different than someone who is able-bodied, filling this out, just trying to do best effort. Maybe they're a general quality assurance tester and not an accessibility tester. You get wildly different results, less quality results. And it might show up of, yes, we're compliant, but it's not actually true. And then somebody with a disability comes in, tries to use the product, and it doesn't actually work for them. So I will say, like, as we keep going, this hopefully will create more and more opportunity for companies and organizations to hire people with disabilities, to have people with disabilities actually providing the testing, providing the insights, getting more embedded into the design and such. Hopefully this will create that sort of systemic change, but it won't happen without intentionality. So hopefully Technoprize and others will be able to assist. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I feel you've just kind of made part of my point, and I don't know why I'm talking. No, just building upon that, and I think when you start talking about enforcement, there is this need to ensure that whoever your enforcement organization is, they can draw on expertise that can independently validate products and services at scale, at a huge scale. And I think that's kind of part of the challenge within any of this as well. It's tied with the general education, it's tied with education for developers and ensuring it's tied with the regulators building their services up, but there's also that market need for independent organizations who are capable of giving good quality, consistent feedback to organizations for the regulators, because without that, you can't say whether or not someone passes or fails against your standard.
And this is Christopher from Google. Building on both of these and looking to our friends at Safaricom, we're at a point now, because of the specification, that operating systems and telephones need to be made more accessible. But what's interesting is the OEMs themselves don't know if things are accessible or not. So I want this opportunity from the standards can create innovation, can create an opportunity to build new partnerships and opportunities to really change things. So as an example for the room, Safaricom and Google have been talking for almost a year about how to help them make their phones more accessible and then train the OEMs to do the same. And what's interesting is this change that happens in Africa is going to sort of blossom around the world, because an OEM isn't just going to make a change for Kenya. It's also going to impact Southeast Asia. It's also going to impact Latin America. So what's actually happening here in some instances is this ICT standard is going to change the world for many people in ways that we didn't expect, because we were so busy just trying to get it done. But looking at the way these things ripple out, the opportunity is really quite profound.
Thanks, Irene. Actually, Chris, you partly took out my words from my mouth. The point is the multiplying effect of how we do accessibility. And two things I want to add, like, I know everybody loves Siri. While you're driving, you use her, but I think Apple claims it to us, and then we're happy with that. So the things, everybody prefers the elevator. Even though there are stairs, Schwab doesn't get a priority. So, but they get there. Two things I want to say is the first thing is accessibility being a precondition. For me, it's not a right. It's a precondition for all the rights. For me to be educated, for me to be employed, anything. It's a precondition. That's how I have. I'm able to be educated. That's how I'm able to. So this is not a niche. This is a granola. This is a precondition that we're dealing with. And secondly, I think believing in the power of the youth with disabilities. I didn't hear them quite well mentioned, and I spend most of my time with the young people because of my work in UNICEF. And then when I go and ask them something, they say, "No, it's not there on the Google manual, or it's not there in the Microsoft keyboard shortcut, but we have figured it out that maybe you have created it, but you didn't know it. But in their life, it's their daily." So I think believing in the power of the young persons with disabilities in this region also, and how to really engage them. I love talking to them, and the way they create solutions out of the prohibitions, out of the deprivations that they have been. So I think how really can use them to transform. because I think always the solution comes mainly from the group facing the challenge. And I heard a bit of education, and this is a AU Year of Education, and this morning I didn't hear it being mentioned also. And as UNICEF, we work with a couple of you in this room to really transform education, become digital. We're in the meantime worried about the digital divide. I mean, we engage in accessible digital textbooks and things like that. The more digital we push, the more also we're concerned about those we're leaving behind. So how can we strike that balance as we push? And I don't think it's already out of our hands. Education is no longer going to be traditional. I think the digital world is already there. And I always tell my colleagues, okay, take out your phone. Go to Apple Store or Google, Android store. Accessibility is there. It's not in your office. It's a shame. So that's a good way. I mean, there has been some good progresses. But still, again, I just want to emphasize that it's a precondition. I don't think it's optional. And as you said, I mean, the numbers really are big. Once you create them, everybody uses them. But for the advocacy, I think it's less people that we see. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's see if anyone online would like to comment before we wrap up. Lucarito, I think I'll come to you last. We have someone from DRC. Do you want to comment? You're on mute. We also have Kofivi from Togo. And we have Gloria from Sudan, South Sudan. Please unmute if you want to say something. Okay. Oh, Kofi.
Hello.
Hello, Kofi.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm from Togo. It's a pleasure for me to participate at this meeting. So the meeting is in English. I'm for a French language country, so I don't understand very well, and then I can't explain my idea and converse with you as it needs. So for the next time, I apologize to translate the session for the French language. Thank you.
Yeah, Kofi.
So I didn't present myself. I'm from conformity assessment body at Togo. So we are at the high authority of quality with the standard body, the conformity assessment body, and the metrology body. So I'm a Director General of Conformity Assessments Body. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi, and we are very sorry. Actually, the conference does have French translation, but I think we forgot to include it in our roundtable. So, but you will receive a report. We will do a very good report about this discussion. So please expect something from us. Anyone else? DRC, and then South Sudan, Gloria, and then we have Uwimana Clement from Rwanda. If you want to say something, just unmute, and then we can wrap up with Lucarito from Kenya Bureau of Standards. So I will assume no one. Lucarito, are you still there? You're on mute.
Yes, I'm there. You can hear me?
Yes. So we were saying maybe you can wrap up the meeting for us. You can say something.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it has been a very good discussion this afternoon, engaging on this topic of standardization and specifically looking at how we can harmonize the African standard. Allow me to mention that standardization is usually a process, and it involves three things. One of them is initiating the process itself. Then there's a second part of developing the standard. Then the most critical part is the third one, which is implementation of the standard. Perhaps it is easier to do the first and the second part, but when it comes to implementation, there is a whole journey that we shall be moving together. But first things first, let us progress with the harmonization of the standard. Then when we come to implementation, that's where we shall have a lot of review, amendment, changes to the standard that we have developed based on the actual practice during implementation. Of course, we shall also learn challenges and lessons learned from the whole process. Then we can go back into the review of the standard so that we make it better. We usually say in ISO 9001 that this is a continual improvement process, and we are alive to that fact that actually standards are not static. They are dynamic documents. They are living documents. And we are alive to that fact that when you develop the standard, sometimes you may not agree 100% at the initial or stages, but we understand that these are living documents. Therefore, sometimes you say, let us move on. We cross the bridge as we implement. If we find some areas that cannot be implemented, then we go back into the review and amendment of the standard to make it better on each basis as we implement those standards. But overall, I think it's a journey that we've begun, and going back is not an option. We have to move forward, and we shall be looking for much needed resources in terms of finance, in terms of capacity, in terms of even testing facilities. I know my colleagues have mentioned about the certification of those products again. It's a journey that we need to work together so that we can make people with disability feel that that they are part of the whole community and the inclusivity. Therefore, moving forward, I think I'm very happy to have participated in this conference, virtually though. But I'm glad that the discussion going into this conference will inform the future steps that we are going to take towards having an African standards on ICT accessibility and inclusivity. I think those are my closing remarks, Irene, and I'm very happy to have met all of you, and we are going to move together as a team as we develop those standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucorito. I think I'll give the person from DRC. You can unmute if you want to say something. You can introduce yourself. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. All right, so we are coming to the end of this session, unless someone has something to say. I think we still have a very long way to go. And definitely we'll be reaching out. We haven't put any stakeholders together. We haven't done any of that. It will be a collaborative effort with the 43 African countries, because if they choose to participate, then they need to say who in their countries will participate. But also that includes disability organizations, PWDs, but also for private sector companies, we'll definitely invite private sector companies from different industries so that at least we are well represented. So I want to say thank you so much to each one of you for coming. I know it was after lunch and some of you had to rush, but I want to say thank you, and please expect a report. We will put together a report that maybe you can share with your colleagues. And then when we call the next roundtable, we will be calling, as we kick off, when the plan is set and we're ready to go, we will definitely invite you for another roundtable, and we hope you can show up. So thank you for being part of Inclusive Africa. Thank you.